I'm here with Georgia Hall. In today's conversation, Georgia and I are going to discuss the US energy infrastructure sector's rapid shift to decarbonise to net zero. But before we get into net zero, how is ESG relevant to the global listed infrastructure space?
Well, if there was any a set of industries that would be relevant to ESG, it would be infrastructure. We're talking about long-dated, strategically important assets that essentially will hold the keys to our transition to a low-carbon world. So we're talking about assets that deliver electricity and energy services to customers, transportation services, water utilities, and communications. So yes, these are essential services that are really integral to our day-to-day lives. And when I think about the definition of infrastructure that we apply on the team, we really benefit from being able to do a deep dive and analysis of ESG factors in our investment universe, as opposed to, say, for example, trying to cover everything but nothing at the same time. And on your point, Duncan, climate risk and emissions reduction measures are absolutely integral to the way that we look at the infrastructure universe, and that has been top of mind of our conversations with companies this quarter.
So we mentioned net zero at the start. What does net zero actually mean?
It's a really good question, and there's a lot of jargon in the ESG space, and we've seen lots of headlines coming out to the fore in the past few months around net zero commitments. Essentially what it means is it's different from absolute zero emissions. Absolute zero emissions is exactly as you would expect, no emissions whatsoever. A net zero commitment is essentially when a company is reducing its emissions, but any additional emissions that it is producing are offset in some way. So that could be through reforestation measures or carbon offsets. But net zero commitments, there's a difference between ambition versus implementation and policy to back that piece of work that would be needed to decarbonise. So essentially in the team, our real focus has been sorting out the wheat from the chaff. Which companies are actually setting these ambitious targets and implementing policy and governance to guide their approach, versus which companies are announcing these measures without actually the implementation that's needed to drive them forward. And that is really the key question that I think a lot of people have been asking as of today.
That's quite an interesting background. I guess, can we relate it more to the types of sectors that you think a net zero target is more relevant to in the infrastructure space?
Well, certainly. So net zero can mean lots of different things for different companies. You can have a net zero commitment for a utilities company where they actually have control and they own the energy that they are distributing to the end customer. So their ability to actually decarbonise is much, I'd say, easier relative to other industries such as midstream pipelines, where they're essentially delivering energy from A to B and they don't have control over the emissions of the end customer. So the difference between industries is really acute, and I think that when it comes to the way that we look at companies, we want to understand the scope of emissions that are being captured in these targets. So one of the charts that we have here is really considering, it outlines scope 1, 2 and 3. And without getting into too much technical detail about this, scope 1 and 2 emissions are the emissions that are owned and controlled by the company. So for a utilities company, they can essentially dictate whether that energy or electricity comes from renewable sources, coal-fired power generation or natural gas. Whereas a midstream pipeline, as I mentioned, its scope 1 and 2 emissions are more within its control, but the scope 3 emissions that are essentially the emissions of the end customer are really hard to abate. And that is one of the key questions that is being asked in the ESG space at the moment.
And in terms of specific sector, when we look at something like transportation, we think of toll roads, airports, etc. How would some of those sectors look to achieve net zero?
It's a good question. And so in the transportation sector, or for example, airports, those are, when I say transportation, I'm talking about, for example, toll roads. They have the ability to decarbonise their own assets, so their tunnels, for example, or putting LED lights on to reduce their actual energy usage. But they also have exposure to the tail end emissions, which is the people on the roads or the people that are flying on the airlines. So that's a very challenging aspect to consider, but it's also worth remembering that one company's scope 3 emissions are another company's direct emissions. And that is also where industry collaboration is needed between the airports and the airlines, and the toll roads and the manufacturing sector. So supporting the infrastructure for electricity to charge cars, for example, over long distances is an integral way that an infrastructure asset can support the electrification of vehicles and therefore encourage more people to purchase electric vehicles and therefore incentivize the manufacturing in that space because the infrastructure is in place to support that.
How does all this translate for risks and opportunities into the US energy infrastructure space?
Well, there's been a huge amount of movement in terms of efforts to decarbonise in the US, and one might think that perhaps the political landscape there is not supportive of decarbonisation efforts, but actually we're seeing quite different stories unfold. To date, at least 7 states in the US have committed to net zero targets of various timelines. But we're also seeing many utilities companies, for example, where, as I mentioned, they have more control over their emissions, setting these net zero targets to achieve by a certain date. So on the chart that we have got up on the screen, you will see this huge uptake of 80 to 100% carbon reduction targets for the utility sector in the light blue and then in the dark blue for statewide commitments. So you can see how these two areas coming together contribute to essentially more than 50% of electricity sales carbon emissions for the entirety of the US. Really, I think this chart is demonstrating the trajectory that we're on, which is that these efforts are coming together to quite substantially reduce emissions in the US. The interesting aspect around the risks and opportunities of this space is that the increasing cost efficiencies of renewables and the ongoing cost of decommissioning coal-fired power plants and maintenance costs is actually leading to a really interesting investment opportunity over the long term, which is that not only does it make sense by the environment, but the economics actually stack up in terms of the ways in which companies are investing for the future. When I think about other risks to consider here, a company is incentivized to reduce its emissions because regulatory or policy change that may come down the pipeline, for example, a carbon tax or cap and trade schemes, means that it would fare better over the long term to reduce its emissions and therefore reduce the cost passed through to the customer of something like a carbon tax. So you can see how these different themes are sort of coming together, whereby governments are implementing policy, the regulatory construct is supportive, investors are driving in this direction, it's the right thing for the environment, and also the actual economics stack up, as I mentioned.
You've just mentioned investors there. As part of your research process, do you actually engage with companies on this specific issue?
In terms of climate risk and emissions, that is top and centre of our discussion with companies. And over this quarter, particularly I think as people have been talking about this green recovery off the back of the COVID pandemic, we've really seen these conversations accelerate. So for us, when we've been talking to companies, those companies that have implemented net zero targets, we want to understand the policy, the governance, the risk management that supports these measures, but also the companies that are not there yet. We want to work with them and encourage them to implement best practice and say, for example, achieve accreditation through various schemes and align their reporting so that as investors, we have decision-ready information when it comes to their ESG reporting. And in addition to that, we've also seen this huge uptake of renewables and decommissioning of coal-fired power plants. So the conversation has definitely centered around that.
It sounds to me like this space is ripe for standards, settings, and governance. Are there any standards bodies out there?
It's a great question. And the problem with ESG is that it's very difficult to find comparable, reliable, transparent, and consistent information. So when it comes to net zero emissions targets, as I mentioned earlier, not each target or commitment is like for like. They're not created equal. So standards bodies such as the Science-Based Targets Initiative is considered to be really one of the penultimate bodies that accredits companies for these commitments. Equally, the Greenhouse Gas Protocol, which is essentially a reporting standard for companies, these types of bodies and frameworks allow investors to analyse this information and compare like for like. And on that basis, that we really encourage companies to adopt those standards and frameworks, because that will ultimately support the ability to make informed decisions.
No, it's a fair call. Today we've talked about decarbonisation and the net zero. What else as a team, or what else are the sort of key ESG focuses of the team at this point?
Well, aside from obviously the transition to a low carbon economy, a major factor in the climate discussion is around physical risk. Physical risk being more extreme and frequent weather events that will ultimately cause disruption to the world that we live in. And a key aspect of that is, what are infrastructure companies doing to harden their systems, to improve maintenance and resilience, to ensure that they're actually factoring in a changing climate for the future. And with that, of course, aspects such as water scarcity for water utilities. Precipitation levels will change over time, so how will they manage the water in a sustainable and life cycle fashion so that they are accounting for that future? And just on that point, another very, very pertinent and salient factor to any sector actually is modern slavery and human rights. Various regulatory requirements have come out in recent years, and I think the conversation around the prevalence of modern slavery in supply chains has really reached an all-time high. So for us, considering modern slavery aspects for the companies that we invest in, also in the supply chains themselves, is a key factor.
Yeah, we continue to see a groundswell of institutional investor support behind ESG. It is certainly one of the things that a lot of our clients are very interested in. So it's great to have dedicated ESG resources at Maple Brown Abbott.
I agree with you, and the integration of ESG is really, it's part of our DNA at Maple Brown Abbott, and I'm really excited in terms of the trajectory that we're on, and I believe that these types of commitments from companies and governments and regulators is really supporting that tailwind, and it's an exciting time to be in this space.